It started out as a quiet weekend getaway. I had been feeling worn out, and a few days in a cabin, away from the noise of the city, seemed like the perfect way to recharge. A friend of mine had a small cabin tucked deep in the woods about a 3-hour drive away. It wasn't exactly luxury. It had no Wi-Fi, no TV, just the basics. A wood stove, a couple of bedrooms, and a porch overlooking a dense forest. But that's exactly what I needed. Peace, isolation, and some time alone to think. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon. The drive had been long, and the winding road leading up to the cabin was barely more than a dirt path. The woods were thick with trees, and the sun was already sinking behind the mountains. As I parked in front of the cabin, I couldn't help but notice how quiet everything was. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional distant call of a bird. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like something is just waiting to break it. I grabbed my bags and walked up the creaky porch steps, unlocking the door with the key my friend had given me. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood and something faintly earthy, like pine needles. There was a small kitchen to the left, a living room with a couple of worn couches, and a fireplace on the far wall. The light was dim, but there was something warm about it. I liked the way it felt, isolated but comfortable. The place was as simple as I remembered. I threw my bags onto the couch, unpacked a bit, and made myself a cup of tea. I sat by the window, sipping slowly, watching the trees sway in the twilight. There was something about the woods here that felt different, more alive in a way. I had spent time in the wilderness before, but this place was different. Maybe it was the stillness or the feeling of being so far from anything. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way. As the sky darkened, I built a fire in the fireplace and settled in. I had no intention of doing much, just relaxing, maybe reading, and enjoying the solitude. But as the hours passed and the wind picked up, I started to notice something. The cabin, despite its solitude, didn't feel empty. There was a sense of presence, like someone or something was just outside my line of sight. The kind of sensation you get when you feel eyes on you, even when no one is there. I tried to ignore it. It was just my imagination, I told myself. The crackling fire and the wind outside were enough to fill the silence. But then it happened. A noise, a soft tapping, almost like a finger drumming on wood. But it wasn't coming from inside. Came from the direction of the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't remember hearing anyone approach. I hadn't seen a single car on the road leading up to the cabin. I set my tea down, stood up, and cautiously walked over to the door. There was nothing, just the dark outline of the porch and the trees beyond. The wind was picking up now, howling through the branches, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing there, just out of view. I double-checked the lock and returned to the fire. My hands were shaking, but I tried to push the unsettling feeling aside. I was alone. There was nothing out there, just the wind. I settled back onto the couch, trying to convince myself to relax. But the longer I sat there, the more the silence felt suffocating. Every crack of the wood, every shift in the breeze felt magnified. My mind kept drifting back to the tapping sound. Had I imagined it, or had someone really been there? The night stretched on, and I eventually went to bed. I kept the curtains closed tightly, and I slept fitfully, waking up several times, disoriented, with the sense that something was wrong. The wind outside had grown stronger, rattling the windows and making the whole cabin creak. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling exhausted. I hadn't slept well, and the strange noises from the night before were still fresh in my mind. I told myself it was just the wind, that the cabin was old, and it had its quirks. But something still felt off. I went out onto the porch to get some fresh air, hoping to clear my head. The sun was up now, casting long shadows over the forest. Everything looked so peaceful, too peaceful. The forest stretched out in every direction, a dense thicket of trees and underbrush. The silence was back, but this time it felt even more oppressive, as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. I decided to take a walk. Maybe the exercise would help shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I grabbed a jacket, put on my boots, and headed down a narrow trail that led into the woods. First, it was nice. The sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light on the ground. I walked for about an hour, lost in the quiet beauty of the place. But then, as I was rounding a bend in the trail, I noticed something strange, something out of place. A set of footprints, fresh ones. They were larger than mine, deeper in the soft earth, and they led off the trail, disappearing into the underbrush. I stopped dead in my tracks. I was certain I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail when I left the cabin. The prints looked recent, maybe from the last few hours. They didn't seem to belong to any animal I recognized. I followed them instinctively, even though my gut was screaming at me to turn back. The trail grew more overgrown as I moved deeper into the woods, and the prints became harder to follow, but I kept going. My breath came in shallow bursts, and my pulse thudded in my ears. Every step felt heavier than the last. The trail eventually led me to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it. A broken-down shack, barely visible through the thick brush. It was made of old wood, its windows shattered, and its roof sagging under the weight of age. I felt my stomach drop. I didn't know why, but the sight of it unsettled me more than anything else I had encountered. There was no reason for a shack to be so far out here, in the middle of nowhere. I stepped closer, carefully, trying not to make any noise. My mind raced with questions. Who built this place? Who would live out here so far from the cabin, in the heart of the woods? I reached the door of the shack and hesitated. Something told me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know. I pushed the door open with a creak and stepped inside. The interior was dark, with the faint smell of mold and decay. The floor was covered in dust, and the walls were bare except for a few faded pictures and some old shelves. But what caught my eye were the marks on the floor, scattered, faint, almost like scratches. Took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. They were recent, too recent. Suddenly, the air felt thick, suffocating. My pulse raced, and I quickly turned to leave. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, like someone was breathing behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. I didn't wait to investigate further. I bolted out of the shack, my breath ragged, and didn't stop running until I reached the cabin. By the time I got back, it was late afternoon. My mind was a blur, spinning with confusion and dread. Had I imagined the whole thing? The shack, the footprints, the whisper? It all felt like a dream or a nightmare. I locked the door and closed all the windows, not daring to go outside again. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to calm myself down. The shadows outside seemed to press against the cabin walls, and the silence was oppressive. It felt like the woods themselves were watching, waiting for something. As the night deepened, I heard it again, the tapping, faint but distinct. It was coming from the direction of the door. I grabbed the fireplace poker and stood by the door, my breath shallow, waiting. The noise grew louder, more persistent. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. And then I realized the footprints, the shack, the strange sounds, they weren't random. They were all connected. Something or someone had been out there and they were watching me. But I wasn't alone anymore. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like there was something protecting me. Something that had been with me all along. The presence that had been lingering in the cabin wasn't a threat. It was a warning. The tapping started again, but this time it was different. It wasn't outside anymore. It was inside. I turned toward the sound, and for the first time I understood. The cabin wasn't empty, and it wasn't mine to keep. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, just a simple getaway to escape the noise of the city. I needed time to breathe, clear my head, and maybe even get some writing done. So when I found this cabin in the middle of nowhere, tucked away in the woods, I thought it was perfect. The listing said it was rustic but cozy, surrounded by trees with only a small creek running nearby. Nothing else for miles. I'd be alone, just me, nature, and peace. I should have known from the start that it was too good to be true. The drive to the cabin took longer than expected. I had to navigate narrow, winding roads, and by the time I arrived, it was already getting dark. The sun had dipped behind the trees, and a heavy fog had started rolling in. The temperature dropped too. It felt colder than it had any right to, considering it was supposed to be an early autumn evening. I parked the car in front of the cabin and looked around. It looked exactly like the pictures. Log walls, a small porch with an old rocking chair, and a big fireplace chimney puffing out a thin column of smoke. It was quaint, yes, but there was something unsettling about the stillness in the air. No sounds of animals, no rustling of leaves, just dead silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. I shrugged it off. I'm just imagining things. It's probably the isolation getting to me. The keys were waiting for me inside the little lockbox on the porch. It was a cheap little combination lock, the kind you'd expect to find at a low-cost motel. I slid the keys out, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like wood, old wood, damp and musty, but still pleasant in its own way. The interior was as rustic as the outside, with mismatched furniture and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A few oil lamps sat on the mantel, their wicks still unlit. It felt like no one had lived here for quite a while. I set my bag down and immediately made my way to the kitchen. The floor creaked under my feet as I walked. It wasn't as bad as I had imagined it might be. The kitchen was functional enough, even if it was a little outdated. There was a stove, a refrigerator that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a while, and an old wooden table. But all the essentials were here, so I started making myself comfortable. As the night wore on, the weather worsened outside. The fog grew thicker, and a soft rain began to tap against the roof, adding to the isolation I felt. I lit a few of the oil lamps and sat down with a book, hoping to unwind. There was no phone service out here, no internet, and I figured that would be good for me. I hadn't had a proper break in a while, and this was the kind of escape I needed. But that peace didn't last long. Around midnight, as I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, I heard something. A knock, faint but distinct, coming from the door. I froze. At first, I thought I might have imagined it. Maybe it was the wind or a branch brushing against the house. But no, there it was again. A soft, deliberate knock, 3 quick raps in succession that my heart rate quickened. I hadn't seen another car on the road when I arrived. No one had passed by all day. It was just me here. The idea of someone being out there, knocking at this hour, sent a cold shiver down my spine. I slid out of bed and crept toward the door. The cabin was small, and the layout meant I could hear any sound clearly. My mind raced. Who would be out here at this time of night? There were no other houses around. Maybe it was just a hiker who'd gotten lost in the fog. But even then, why didn't they come to the window or call out instead? I slowly approached the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. The knock came again. Quick, sharp, 3 raps, followed by silence. I froze, just standing there, too scared to open the door, too scared to even breathe. But then, a voice. A soft, muffled voice. So quiet I could barely hear it. It sounded like a whisper, but clear enough for me to catch the words. Please help me. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. My mind spun, and I could feel the sweat forming on the back of my neck. I didn't open the door. Couldn't. I backed away from it, my eyes scanning the cabin, looking for any kind of weapon, any sign that I could defend myself if I needed to. I waited. Nothing. After a few minutes, I cautiously moved back to the door. I cracked it open a bit, but no one was there. The fog had thickened, and the rain was now coming down in sheets. The porch light barely lit up the yard, and I couldn't see beyond a few feet in front of me. There was no sign of anyone, but I could still feel the hairs on my neck standing up. I closed the door quickly and locked it. What was going on? Was I just imagining things? But it felt too real, too vivid. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The rest of the night passed in restless, paranoid silence. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. Every little noise made me jump. Footsteps on the porch, the wind, the creaking of the old wood. My eyes darted around the room, checking every shadow, every corner. The morning light was a relief. Felt like I'd barely survived the night. I made myself some coffee and tried to ignore the unease that still gripped me. Maybe I was just being dramatic. I thought, maybe the isolation and the storm had messed with my mind. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The woods around the cabin were dense, the trees towering above me, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers. I walked along a narrow trail that seemed to go on forever, unsure of where it led. The fog had lifted, but the air still felt damp, the ground soft beneath my boots. I wanted to be sure I wasn't losing my mind, so I kept walking, trying to shake the feeling of being followed. Eventually, I came to a clearing. In the middle of it, I found something odd. A small structure, almost hidden by the thick trees around it. It wasn't a house or anything, but some kind of shack. It was old, falling apart, its wooden walls weathered and decayed by time. Something about it felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes you want to run the other way. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to take a closer look. I approached the shack carefully, my eyes scanning the surroundings. There were no signs of anyone being there recently. No footprints. No fresh signs of life. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. A faint smell in the air. A sickly, rotting scent that made my stomach turn. I stepped inside, my boots crunching on the dry leaves and broken wood. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, and there was a rusted stove in one corner, covered in grime. The place had been abandoned for years, or so I thought. Then I saw it. A small, leather-bound book, half buried under some broken furniture. I picked it up, careful not to disturb anything else. When I opened it, I felt my stomach drop. The pages were filled with strange, scrawled writing, scribbles, symbols, and half-finished sentences. Some of the writing was almost unreadable, but there was one page that caught my eye. It was a drawing, no, not a drawing, a map that showed the very cabin I was staying in, with a series of marks and strange notations drawn on it. And in the bottom corner, scrawled in red ink, were the words, "You are not alone." I froze. I could feel my heart racing in my chest. My fingers trembled as I turned the page. There, at the back, were more words. A warning: don't trust the trees. They watch. Suddenly, the air felt thick. I dropped the book, backing away from the shack. My mind raced. What the hell was going on? This wasn't just a harmless getaway. This wasn't just some random stormy night. There was something deeply wrong with this place. I sprinted back to the cabin, not stopping until I was safely inside. My hands were shaking as I locked the door behind me. I couldn't stay here another night. I had to leave, but when I tried to start the car, it wouldn't start. I could feel the panic rising in my chest as I turned the key over and over, but the engine wouldn't even sputter. The battery had died. It took me a while to realize the truth. I wasn't just stuck here by chance. Someone had been watching me from the very beginning, from the moment I arrived. There was no way I could have known it, but I was never meant to leave. It was then that I noticed it, the faint sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps, the same soft, muffled footsteps I had heard the night before. And this time, they weren't stopping. I'd always heard the cabin in the woods was a place for people who wanted to escape everything. A place to clear your mind, get away from the noise of the city, the rush, and the constant pressure. I didn't think much about that when I decided to go. After all, I was looking for some time alone to reset. The thought of being in complete silence, surrounded by nature, sounded like the perfect retreat. The cabin was far out. It wasn't on any map, at least not the ones I had. A long, unmarked road twisted up the mountainside, through thick trees, and around sharp bends that felt like they would send me off the edge of the world. I had rented the place online, and the listing said it would take a few hours to get there. I remember thinking that sounded like a bit much, but I wasn't going to turn back. I arrived just as the sky was dimming. The cabin was an old, weathered building, tucked away behind a large patch of trees. It looked exactly like the kind of place you'd imagine in a horror movie, but there was something oddly comforting about it. The walls were covered in dark, peeling wood that seemed to match the deep colors of the surrounding forest. There were no other houses around for miles, just towering trees, their limbs swaying in the wind. Inside, the place smelled of dust and pine. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, and the furniture, while old, was surprisingly well kept. I immediately felt the weight of isolation. There was no cell service, no Wi-Fi, not even a landline. It was just me, the cabin, and the wilderness. That night, I sat up by the fire with a book I had been meaning to finish. The crackling flames filled the silence, and the air was crisp but not uncomfortable. Every now and then, I'd hear the distant sound of a twig snapping outside or a branch brushing against the side of the cabin. I thought nothing of it. It was just the forest, the wind, the animals, the sounds that came with being alone in the middle of nowhere. But as the night wore on, I noticed something strange. Every time I thought I heard a noise from outside, I'd go to the window to look, but there would be nothing. No movement, no signs of life. Just the still, dark woods stretching out into the unknown. The following morning, I woke up early, the air outside already cool and fresh. I stepped out onto the porch, stretching my legs and taking in the view. The woods seemed even quieter than the night before, a stillness that settled deep in my chest. I was still the only person around as far as I could tell. The nearest town was miles away, and there was no sign of anyone else anywhere nearby. But as I looked around the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I shrugged it off as nerves. I was just here to relax, after all. So, I took a walk down the narrow dirt path that led from the cabin. The sun was still low in the sky, and the forest was a deep shade of green, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the ground. Birds chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled the leaves above me. But there was something else, a low, almost imperceptible sound that I couldn't place. It wasn't the usual forest noises. It was more like a soft shuffle, like someone or something was moving just beyond the trees. I stopped and listened, but the sound stopped too. I shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. I had heard of them in these woods, but there was no denying the unease creeping into my mind. By the time the afternoon came, the unsettling feeling hadn't gone away. In fact, it only seemed to grow stronger. When I went back to the cabin, I double-checked the locks on all the windows and doors, even though I didn't think anyone would be around for miles. But something felt wrong. There was no sign of life out there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That evening, I heard the sound again. It started as a faint rustling, like branches moving in the wind, but it was different, too deliberate. Then, a low thud, like something heavy dropping. My heart started racing, and I immediately grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and went to the door. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, but there was nothing. No footprints, no movement. I stepped outside, trying to calm myself down, telling myself it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. I walked around the cabin, scanning the area, but the forest was still and silent. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the floorboards, made my skin crawl. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned outside, but there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. The next morning, I didn't feel any better. If anything, the dread had grown. I spent most of the day inside, avoiding the outside world, but as the sun began to set, I decided to go back out for a walk. I told myself I had to face whatever this was, to prove I wasn't scared. As I walked down the path again, something caught my eye, a small, weathered object half buried in the dirt by the side of the trail. I bent down to look closer. It was a broken piece of wood, but what made it strange was the carving. It looked like a symbol, a twisted, angular shape, like a crude representation of an eye. I froze. The feeling that had been gnawing at me for days now surged. I stood up quickly, glancing around. The forest was eerily quiet. There was no breeze, no animals, just silence. I walked faster, the uneasy feeling now overtaking my thoughts. My breath came quicker, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. As I turned to head back to the cabin, I heard the shuffling sound again, this time closer, much closer. I broke into a run. I don't know how long I ran, or what pushed me to move so fast, but by the time I reached the cabin, I was breathless and panicked. My heart pounded in my chest. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, rushing to the windows and pulling the curtains tight. I wasn't going out again. The rest of the night was a blur. I spent hours pacing, checking the locks, peering out the windows, but there was nothing, no sign of anyone. The darkness outside seemed to swallow the cabin whole. The next morning, I packed my things. I wasn't going to stay another night. The woods felt too oppressive, too suffocating. The odd symbol, the sounds, the constant feeling of being watched, they had gotten to me. I couldn't shake the terror that had set in. As I started to drive away, I glanced back at the cabin in my rearview mirror. It sat there, still and empty, but for some reason, I couldn't help but feel like I had left something behind. Something that was waiting, watching, hidden in the shadows. It was meant to be a break, a weekend retreat. Just me, the forest, and the silence. I'd been working nonstop for months, always glued to my desk in that same cramped office. Every weekend was filled with errands, chores, and endless social obligations. It felt like I'd forgotten how to be alone, how to enjoy the stillness of being in the middle of nowhere. The cabin in the woods was my escape, or at least it was supposed to be. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was setting. The drive had taken longer than I expected, the winding road a little harder to navigate in the dim light. But I'd finally made it. The cabin sat just off a gravel path, hidden from view by dense trees on all sides. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small, one-story building with a rusted tin roof and a front porch that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But it was perfect for what I needed. Peace, quiet, and time to think. The air felt different here, cleaner somehow. The smell of pine filled my nose as I dragged my suitcase from the car to the porch. The place was completely isolated, no neighbors for miles, and that was exactly what I was looking for.
No distractions, no noise.
Just me and the woods. Inside, the cabin was basic but cozy. Wooden floors creaked under my feet as I stepped through the door. The walls were lined with old furniture, a worn-out couch, a rickety coffee table, a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The kitchen was small, but it had everything I needed. I wasn't planning to spend much time inside anyway. I wanted to explore, get some fresh air, and clear my head. I spent the first hour unpacking, settling in, and then I grabbed my jacket and went outside. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest. I walked along a narrow trail that seemed to lead into the woods, the ground soft with fallen leaves. The trees here were tall, their trunks thick and twisted, the branches high above creating a canopy that blocked out most of the light. It felt peaceful, almost dreamlike. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird in the distance. I walked for what felt like hours, enjoying the solitude. It was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made you aware of every tiny sound. The crunch of a twig beneath my boots, the whisper of wind through the branches. But I didn't mind. I needed this. The longer I walked, the more I felt my stress melt away. When I finally turned around to head back to the cabin, it was almost completely dark. The sun had long since vanished, and the moon was barely a sliver in the sky. The trail I had followed was harder to make out now, the shadows of the trees creating an almost suffocating darkness. I knew I had wandered farther than I intended, but I wasn't worried. I'd seen enough of the area to know I could find my way back easily, or so I thought. I walked for what felt like hours, retracing my steps, but the familiar landmarks, the large rock by the trail, the fallen tree were nowhere to be found. The darkness was getting thicker, and the sounds of the forest seemed to be closing in on me. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees in an eerie way, and I could hear things moving in the underbrush, though I couldn't see what it was. Panic started to set in. I'd gotten lost. It was as simple as that. I tried to stay calm, focusing on breathing, but the more I tried to rationalize the situation, the more my mind started to race. The trees felt closer now, like they were watching me. The wind seemed to carry a sense of urgency, and I could almost feel something or someone following me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I pulled out my phone to check the time, but there was no signal. The screen just displayed no service. Great, that was just perfect. I'd already wandered too far to turn back now, and with no way to contact anyone, I was on my own. I kept walking, telling myself that the cabin was just around the corner, but the more I moved, the less sure I was. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, and every turn felt the same. The trees were like a maze, and I was trapped in the middle of it. I stumbled over a root, nearly twisting my ankle, and that was when I heard it, a low, distant sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but it grew louder, closer. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. I stopped in my tracks, holding my breath. My heart was pounding in my chest. The footsteps continued, growing louder with each passing second. Someone or something was out there. I strained my ears, trying to listen for more details. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It was human, or at least it sounded human. I backed up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. My mind was racing. Was it another hiker? No, I would have heard their voice or seen their flashlight by now. The air felt charged with something that wasn't right. A feeling of dread was settling in my stomach, and I couldn't shake it. My eyes darted from tree to tree, looking for any sign of movement, but the darkness was overwhelming. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. Complete silence followed, as if whatever it was had just vanished. I stood frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Every muscle in my body was tense, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run. But where would I run to? The cabin was too far away. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting for the sound to return, but eventually, I forced myself to move. I took a few slow steps forward, each one feeling heavier than the last. The air was thick with tension, and I kept expecting to hear the footsteps again, but they never came. It was as if whatever had been there was just waiting, watching. The feeling of being hunted wouldn't leave. After what felt like hours, I finally saw a faint glow in the distance. The cabin. I found it. Relief washed over me, and I pushed myself to walk faster, my legs burning from exhaustion. I reached the porch just as the first drops of rain started to fall. I was safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there with me, something that had been following me through the woods. The cabin was silent, but the air inside felt oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on me. I locked the door behind me, drew the curtains, and sat on the couch, trying to steady my breathing. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made me jump. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The sky was gray, and the air felt thick with moisture. I didn't want to leave the cabin, but I knew I had to. I needed to get out of that forest. I grabbed my things, packed up, and left. As I was driving away, I couldn't help but glance at the trees, the woods that had felt so peaceful at first. There was nothing there, nothing visible, but I knew something was out there, something that had been watching me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that, even though I was leaving, it wasn't over. The drive back was long, but it gave me time to think. Maybe I'd just been paranoid, I thought. Maybe I had let my fear get the best of me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. Whatever had been in those woods was real, and I would never forget it. I always thought the idea of spending a weekend alone in a cabin would be peaceful, maybe even a little refreshing. My friend Mark had been trying to get me to do it for months. "You need a break," he'd said. "Get out into nature. Clear your head." I didn't really need a reason. I was worn out from the constant noise of city life, the grind, the people, the deadlines. A weekend alone sounded perfect. So, I packed my bags and drove out to the cabin Mark had rented. It was way out in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. It didn't even have Wi-Fi. The place was small, just a little two-room cabin, with a wood stove and a big stone fireplace that looked like something out of a movie. The air smelled fresh, like pine trees and earth. I figured I'd spend my time reading, maybe cooking some simple meals and just getting some rest. The drive had taken a few hours, but it wasn't too bad. The sun was setting as I arrived, casting long shadows over the trees. I grabbed my things from the trunk and headed up the short path to the cabin. It had an old wooden sign that read "Whispering Pines." Sounded cheesy, but I didn't mind. Inside, the cabin had that rustic charm that people seem to love. The furniture was worn, the floor creaked underfoot, and everything smelled like cedar. It was cozy. There was a large armchair by the fire, a little kitchen with a small table, and a loft above that could be reached by a wooden ladder. I couldn't see the upstairs too clearly in the dim light, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going to be here long enough to explore. After lighting the stove and unpacking, I sat in front of the fire. The flames crackled, and I settled into the chair with a book I'd brought. The night was quiet, too quiet in a way. The occasional sound of a branch snapping in the wind or the distant hoot of an owl was about all I heard. That was when I first noticed it. A low scraping sound. It was faint, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Came from outside, maybe from the woods behind the cabin. I froze, trying to focus. It sounded like something dragging along the ground, slow and deliberate. I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal, but there was something unnerving about it. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. I shrugged it off. I'd heard sounds like that in the woods before. Animals, especially at night, could make strange noises. I was just being paranoid. I went back to reading, but the unease lingered in the back of my mind. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the trees, and the temperature seemed to drop a little. I was getting tired, so I decided to head up to bed. The ladder to the loft was steep, but it wasn't too bad. The upstairs was small, with a bed and a few old boxes. The bed had a thick quilt on it, and I sunk into it, pulling the blankets around me. I couldn't sleep at first. I kept hearing the wind, the trees rattling against each other, but there was also something else, something faint, like footsteps. I sat up, listening, but the sounds faded away. Could have been my imagination. I was just tired. I closed my eyes, trying to shut it all out. Eventually, I drifted off into a light sleep, but it wasn't peaceful. In the middle of the night, I woke up with a start, heart racing. I couldn't explain why at first. My mind was foggy from sleep, but something felt wrong. There was a pressure in the air, a heaviness. My body was frozen, as if I could sense something that wasn't right. Then the scraping sound came again. This time it was louder, closer. I sat up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. It was coming from below, just outside the cabin. Something was definitely dragging along the ground. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand, but there was no signal. The cabin was in a dead zone. I waited, listening. The noise stopped, and then, as if in response, a loud thud echoed from below. It sounded like something heavy had hit the cabin's wall. I wanted to call for help, but I couldn't even hear my own voice. I stayed still, my breath shallow, trying to hear anything else. There was nothing. No more scraping, no more thudding. Just silence. I stayed up for hours, not daring to move. The fear gnawed at me. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of the wind outside made my skin crawl. Eventually, I heard the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor below. Slow, methodical steps. My pulse raced. Who else was out there? Mark had told me there was no one else nearby for miles. I didn't want to go down there. I didn't want to move at all, but I knew I couldn't stay in the loft forever. My mind raced through every possibility. It had to be an animal, right? But the sound of footsteps was unmistakable. Couldn't be a bear or anything like that. It was too deliberate. I decided to peek down the ladder. Holding my breath, I slid my head over the edge and looked down into the cabin. The fire had died down, leaving only a faint glow from the embers. In the dim light, I could make out shapes. Furniture, the window, the door. But there was no one there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight, and before I could think better of it, I was already halfway down the ladder. The air was cold, and the house felt empty, but there was something oppressive about it, like the walls were closing in. I stood at the bottom of the ladder, scanning the room. The door was locked. The windows were intact. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved across the room to the kitchen, but there was no sign of anything unusual. I exhaled, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. But then, as I turned to head back toward the ladder, I saw it. The window. The blinds were pulled halfway up. I was certain I hadn't touched them. The flashlight beam shook in my hand as I approached. Slowly, cautiously, I moved toward it. I could see movement through the cracks in the blinds. Something out there, just beyond my reach. I froze. My heart dropped. A figure stood outside, half hidden by the darkness. I couldn't make out details, but I could tell it was tall, and its shape was unnaturally still. I backed away from the window, my chest tightening. Then it moved, quickly, like something unnatural. I bolted toward the door, heart in my throat. I couldn't even think. I didn't know what I was running from, but I had to get out of there. The door wouldn't open. I yanked on the handle, panic flooding my brain. It was stuck. I hit it with my shoulder, but it wouldn't budge. I turned to look at the window again, my breath shallow, and I saw the figure in the reflection of the glass. It was closer now, almost right against the wall. A sudden crash. The door splintered open. Without thinking, I ran. I ran out the door, down the path, not stopping to look back. My mind was racing, my legs burning from the effort, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. I don't know how long I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where I collapsed, gasping for air. I pulled out my phone, finally managing to get a weak signal. I called Mark, my hands shaking. He didn't answer. I didn't go back to the cabin. I stayed in the car, parked on the side of the road, and waited until morning. When the sun finally rose, I called for help. A couple of local deputies came to check out the cabin. When they arrived, they told me no one had been there. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone breaking in. They searched the area, found nothing. I left that day driving straight back home, and I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I don't know what I saw or heard that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me in the isolation. But I can't shake the feeling that something was there with me, something that didn't want me to leave. And I'll never forget the way it moved.
So fast.
So unnatural. I haven't stepped foot in the woods since. I had always wanted a break, a weekend getaway from the noise, the constant buzz of phones, and the stress of work. When I found that old cabin for rent deep in the woods, it felt like a perfect escape. The listing claimed it was secluded, surrounded by nothing but trees and nature, far from any busy roads or distractions. It was exactly what I was looking for. I was tired of the city, the people, the constant rush. I needed solitude, silence, and the kind of peace only a remote place could offer. I loaded up my car with supplies, enough food for the weekend, a few books, a sleeping bag, and my guitar, and started the drive. The further I drove, the more I felt myself unwind, the tension in my shoulders easing with each mile. The roads got narrower, the trees thicker, and the houses fewer and farther apart. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dirt road. The cabin itself looked exactly as the pictures had shown, old but sturdy. A wooden structure, weathered by years of exposure to the elements. The windows were small, with thick curtains drawn over them, and the porch was covered with a layer of dry leaves. It was isolated just like I wanted. No neighbors for miles, just the sound of wind rustling the trees and the occasional bird call. I parked my car, grabbed my things, and walked up to the front door. There was no key under the mat or in the usual hiding spots, so I fumbled with the lock for a moment before the door creaked open. Inside, the air smelled musty, like old wood and dust. The floors were covered with faded rugs, and the furniture, though simple, had a kind of rustic charm. A stone fireplace stood at the far end of the living room, the hearth dark and cold. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was, the kind of silence you only get when you're far away from civilization. I loved it. I dropped my bags and took a deep breath, letting the stillness fill me. As I explored the cabin, I realized it was small, just one room with a loft upstairs. There was a kitchen area in the corner, a small table with a couple of chairs, and a narrow staircase leading up to the loft. The loft had a single bed, a small dresser, and a tiny window that looked out over the woods. The view was incredible, just miles of trees stretching as far as I could see. I decided to settle in. I put my things in the loft, grabbed my guitar, and made myself some dinner. As the evening wore on, I sat by the fire, playing a few tunes and watching the flames dance. The crackling of the fire, the sound of the wind outside. It was peaceful. But as the night went on, I started to notice something strange. The quiet was almost too quiet. There were no animals in the distance, no sounds of insects buzzing or owls hooting. It was as if the entire forest had gone still. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the hours dragged on, the silence started to feel heavier, almost oppressive. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the remoteness of the place, that it was normal for it to be this still. But the more I sat there, the more uneasy I became. I went to bed around midnight, curling up in the loft under a thick quilt. The bed was comfortable enough, and the air had cooled, making it perfect for sleeping. But sleep didn't come. I kept hearing things, soft thuds from downstairs, like footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then I heard a scraping sound. I froze. The sound came again, followed by a low thump. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. The noise seemed to be coming from just outside the cabin. I couldn't see anything through the small window, and the curtains were drawn tight, but I swore I saw a shadow pass across the edge of the glass. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was an animal, a raccoon, or something larger. The wind was picking up, and I thought perhaps the branches of the trees were brushing against the side of the cabin. But then I heard it again, soft, deliberate footsteps, pacing back and forth just outside. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table and slowly made my way down the stairs. I didn't want to open the door, but I had to see what was out there. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I tiptoed to the front door. I held my breath, listening for any more sounds. The footsteps had stopped, but now there was a new sound, something scraping against the wood of the cabin. It was faint, but it was there. I twisted the doorknob and slowly pushed the door open just a crack, shining the flashlight outside. The beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the porch and the surrounding woods. There was nothing there. I breathed a sigh of relief, but as I stepped back inside, I heard the noise again, this time louder and closer. It was coming from the back of the cabin. My pulse quickened. What the hell was going on? I didn't want to go outside, but I also didn't want to just sit here and wait. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that something was out there, watching the cabin. I grabbed the iron poker from beside the fireplace and cautiously made my way to the back door. When I opened it, the wind hit me hard. The forest stretched out in front of me, empty and still. The flashlight beam shook slightly in my hand as I scanned the area, but there was nothing to see. I stepped outside, every muscle in my body tensed. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked around the cabin, checking the corners and looking for anything out of place. The night air was cold, and the trees loomed over me like silent sentinels. I felt exposed out here, vulnerable. Suddenly, I heard it, a sharp, jagged sound from somewhere nearby, something scratching at the trees, dragging along the bark. I whipped around, shining the light in all directions, but again, I saw nothing. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it wasn't normal. I rushed back inside, slamming the door behind me. The house felt safer, but even then, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I locked the door, bolted the windows, and sat in the dark, waiting for morning. But sleep didn't come. The sounds continued throughout the night, faint and eerie, scraping and tapping against the walls of the cabin. It was as though something was trying to get in. I didn't know what it was, but I felt it. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the cracks in the curtains, I felt a strange sense of relief. The sounds had stopped, and the world outside looked calm again. The woods were quiet, but not oppressively so. It was as if whatever had been out there had disappeared. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of dread. The cabin, once a retreat, now felt like a trap. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to drive back. The roads were treacherous, and the thought of being stuck out there in the dark again made my skin crawl. That evening, as the sun began to set, I decided to make my escape. I packed up quickly, not bothering to check the cabin for anything I might have left behind. I just wanted to get out. As I drove down the dirt road, I kept my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing. The woods were silent again, the trees dark and still in the fading light. I finally reached the highway, and with a sense of relief, I drove toward the nearest town. I wasn't sure what had happened that weekend, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going back. The cabin, the isolation, the strange sounds. It had all been too much. I never learned what was out there in the woods, but I didn't need to. Sometimes it's best to leave certain things in the dark. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, just me and the quiet of the mountains. I had rented the cabin months in advance, looking for a break from the city, something simple and disconnected. No distractions, no work emails, no people. Just a few days of nothing but the sound of birds and the wind in the trees. The cabin stood on the edge of a dense forest, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I drove for hours to get there, my car winding through narrow, overgrown roads. The further I went, the fewer signs of civilization there were. I barely passed another vehicle. There was something unsettling about the isolation, but I shrugged it off. I'd always liked being alone. When I finally arrived, it was late afternoon. The sky was a dull gray, clouds rolling in from the horizon. The cabin was exactly as it had looked in the photos. Rustic, weathered wood with a porch that creaked when I stepped on it. It looked old, but sturdy, and I liked that. I carried my bags inside, the door creaking in protest as I opened it. The interior was cozy, exactly what I needed. A large stone fireplace, wooden beams overhead, a leather couch, and a small kitchen tucked into the corner. There was no electricity, just gas lamps that I flicked on one by one, bathing the room in a soft, yellow glow. Felt warm, safe, like the world outside couldn't reach me here. I unpacked my things, made myself a simple dinner, and sat by the fire with a book. The first night was quiet. Too quiet, really, but I didn't mind. After all, that's what I had come for. The silence was a blessing. But the next day, things started to feel off. I woke up early, as I always do, the faint light from outside creeping through the curtains. The air felt colder than usual, but I assumed it was just the mountain weather. I made coffee and went outside to sit on the porch, the wooden floor cool under my feet. The trees stretched up into the sky, their leaves rustling softly in the wind. It was peaceful, just like I had imagined. I didn't think much of it at first, but as the day went on, I began to notice things that didn't sit right. Small things, but enough to make my stomach turn. The wind seemed to carry a strange hum, like a low whistle through the branches. The birds were quiet, but there were other sounds, things that didn't belong. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. After all, the woods were full of wildlife. But the more I listened, the more I felt like I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, felt like it was aimed directly at me. By mid-afternoon, I decided to take a hike. I had mapped out a trail that was supposed to lead to a small lake a few miles away. The fresh air and the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt trail would clear my head. I grabbed a backpack, threw in a bottle of water, and headed out. The trail wound through the trees, the thick underbrush brushing against my legs. As I walked, the unsettling feeling from earlier started to fade. The trail was well-marked, easy to follow, and for a while, I let myself relax. The further I went, the deeper into the forest I seemed to get, but I wasn't worried. I had a map, and I knew I wasn't far from the cabin. But then I reached a point where the trail seemed to disappear. It wasn't anything drastic, just a small bend in the path where the trees grew thick and the ground turned marshy. There was no sign of the trail marker anymore, no direction to go. I hesitated, staring at the mess of underbrush and tangled branches ahead. I tried retracing my steps, but the forest around me felt unfamiliar. Had I missed something? The feeling of being watched returned, sharper now, like there was something out there in the woods just beyond my sight. I quickened my pace, hoping to find the trail again. And then I saw it, a small, dilapidated structure in the distance. It was barely visible through the trees, just a hint of a roof poking out. At first, I thought it might be some kind of old shack or hunting lodge long abandoned. Curiosity got the better of me, and I started toward it. As I got closer, the building became clearer. It was in worse shape than I had imagined. Its walls sagging, windows boarded up. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, as if it hadn't been touched in years. There was a strange smell in the air, a mixture of decay and something sour, but I couldn't place it. I stepped up to the door, the wood creaking under my weight. My hand hovered over the knob, a strange urge pulling me forward. I don't know why I decided to open it, but I did. Inside was a room, dark and musty, with broken furniture scattered about. A layer of dust covered everything. A small table sat against the far wall, next to a fireplace. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew. There was nothing of interest, just the remnants of whatever had once been here. But then, on the table, I saw something. A small, leather-bound book. I don't know why, but I picked it up. The pages were yellowed and fragile, the ink faded with age. As I flipped through it, I saw odd scribblings, sketches of strange symbols, descriptions of the land around the cabin, and references to things I couldn't understand. The writing grew more erratic toward the end of the book, the words almost nonsensical. It was as if someone had been losing their mind, recording everything they saw in the woods. I felt a chill run down my spine, and for the first time, I realized that maybe I wasn't alone. I set the book down quickly, stepped back from the table, and turned to leave. But when I reached the door, I froze. There was something on the other side, a sound. It wasn't a person, no, it was something far worse. It was a deep, guttural growl, like an animal that had been pushed to the edge. My heart raced, and I slowly backed away, my breath shallow. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I had to get out of there. I ran. My feet slipped on the wet ground, the branches whipping at my face as I dashed through the forest, the growl echoing behind me. It was chasing me. Whatever it was hunting me. I didn't stop running until I saw the familiar shape of the cabin through the trees. My legs burned, and my lungs screamed for air, but I pushed forward. I reached the porch and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. For the rest of the night, I sat in front of the fireplace, heart pounding, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. The growling, the book, the strange feeling of being watched. But the longer I sat there, the more it felt real. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat, waiting for morning, for the light of day to bring some sense of safety. But when dawn finally came, the sun weak and distant, something was different. The air was still thick with unease, and the forest outside seemed quieter. The birds were still gone, and the wind was strangely still. I packed my things as quickly as I could, not caring about the mess. I was done. I wasn't going to stay another night in that cabin. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin, the woods, they were all behind me now. But something about the way the trees seemed to watch me, the way the cabin stood in the distance, I knew I would never forget it. The mountains, I realized, were full of secrets. Some were better left untouched. I've never been the type to be afraid of the dark, but something about the woods that night felt different. It was like the trees had a life of their own, creaking and shifting in a way that was too intentional. It was a feeling I couldn't shake. The woods were quiet, unnaturally quiet, and the silence felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the overgrown path that led to it. I had rented the place for the weekend, just a little break from the chaos of the city. I had no intention of doing anything other than unwind. It was supposed to be peaceful. The cabin was secluded, tucked away deep in a forest far from the nearest town. The road was bumpy and barely passable, but I didn't mind. There was something calming about being away from everything, surrounded by nothing but trees. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at, just a small, weathered building with wooden walls and a slanted roof. The paint had long since peeled away, and the place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. Still, the owner assured me it would be fine. I parked the car and grabbed my bags, feeling the weight of the silence around me as I walked up to the front door. The air was still, the smell of damp earth and pine filling my nostrils. I hesitated for a moment, standing on the creaky porch before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The inside was exactly what I expected. It was simple, almost bare. The floors were creaky, and the furniture was old but serviceable. A couch sat in front of a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area to the side. It looked like a place where someone could come to get away from the world for a little while. I'd brought some food with me, just enough for the weekend, and there was a small wood stove in the corner for warmth. I unpacked my things and made myself comfortable, starting a small fire in the fireplace. The warmth spread through the room quickly, and I sank into the couch, staring into the flames. I hadn't planned on doing much, just a bit of reading, maybe some writing. The peace and quiet were exactly what I needed. But as the night settled in, something changed. It was subtle at first, a feeling that crept over me, like I wasn't alone. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I felt eyes on me, as though the walls themselves were watching. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill despite the fire crackling in the hearth. I told myself it was nothing. The woods can play tricks on your mind, especially at night. Maybe I was just imagining things. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one there. I decided to go to bed early, hoping sleep would bring some relief from the unease that had settled in my chest. I turned off the lights and crawled into the bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. The room was dark, but I could hear the wind howling outside, the occasional rustle of branches against the cabin's wooden walls. Sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, the sensation of being watched never leaving me. It was like something was lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness, waiting for me to fall asleep so it could make its move. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke with a start. The air felt heavier now, as though the room had become suffocating. I lay still, listening. There was no sound, no wind, no rustling of branches. Just silence. Deep, unnerving silence. I glanced at the clock on the bedside table. It was well past midnight. That's when I heard it, the faintest sound, coming from somewhere outside the cabin. A soft scraping like nails dragging across wood. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound stopped, and for a moment, there was only the sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just an animal or the wind playing tricks again. But then it came again, louder this time, scraping, and then a soft thud, like something heavy being dropped onto the porch. My blood ran cold. I forced myself to move, to sit up, but my body felt like it was made of lead. I didn't want to get up, didn't want to go check what was out there, but I knew I couldn't stay in that bed, not with the sounds getting closer. Slowly, I slid out from under the covers, my feet touching the cold wooden floor. My heart was pounding in my ears as I crept toward the window, peering through the dusty curtains. The moonlight bathed the forest in an eerie glow, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. There was nothing out there, just trees. The stillness was overwhelming. But then I saw something. a figure barely visible in the shadows near the edge of the trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, standing perfectly still. I couldn't make out any features, but the silhouette was unmistakable. My stomach churned. I didn't know who or what it was, but it wasn't an animal. I stepped back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't know what to do. The sounds had stopped, but that figure, whatever it was still there, standing motionless in the dark. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. I wanted to call someone, but there was no signal out here. The nearest town was miles away. I was alone, completely alone. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy iron skillet, and held it in my hands like a weapon. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Then the door creaked open. I didn't hear anyone turn the handle, didn't hear the footsteps on the porch. The door just opened, slowly, as if something had been waiting for it to move. My heart nearly stopped. I could see the dark shape in the doorway, its outline barely visible in the dim light. I didn't know who or what it was, but in that moment, I realized something. The figure in the woods wasn't the only thing that had been watching me. The door was open now, and I had no choice but to face whatever was standing on the other side. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Just me, a cabin, and a few days of peace away from everything. I hadn't expected to feel anything other than relief when I saw the small, secluded cabin nestled against the edge of the woods. It wasn't much, rustic, with weathered wood and a little porch that had a few mismatched chairs. But it was all I needed. It wasn't far from a town, just a few miles down a dirt road. I had been looking forward to this time alone. Work had been overwhelming, and I needed space to breathe. I pulled up the gravel driveway, the tires crunching under the weight of the car as I parked near the porch. It was quiet, too quiet. No one was around. No cars, no people, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I got out, grabbed my bags from the back seat, and headed inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open. It wasn't locked. The interior was small, dimly lit by the light coming through the dusty windows. The wooden floors were creaky and uneven underfoot. A stone fireplace sat in the far corner, with a couple of old chairs scattered in front. There was a small kitchen area to the left, a table with 2 chairs, and a narrow hallway leading to the bedroom. The place smelled old, like pine wood and something musty, almost like it hadn't been lived in for years. I dropped my bags onto the couch, walked around the place for a few minutes, and found everything in good condition despite the age. The windows weren't cracked, the furniture was solid, and the bedding on the bed seemed clean enough. I decided to take a walk to get a feel for the area. The woods around the cabin looked dense, the trees tall and thick. There were no trails, nothing marked to tell me where I should or shouldn't go. But I didn't mind. I walked around the cabin first, then decided to head down the small path that seemed to cut through the trees toward a small creek. The air was thick with the scent of pine, the earth damp beneath my boots. I followed the sound of running water, the creek louder now as I moved closer. The trees thinned a little, and there was an area where the water pooled into a small, clear pond. It looked peaceful, almost untouched by time. I sat down on a rock by the edge of the water, staring at the reflections of the trees above. The silence around me was deep, almost too deep, like the whole place was holding its breath. It was then that I noticed something strange. There was something off about the edge of the pond. The water was disturbed, just a little, but enough to make me feel uneasy. A small stone, maybe a stick, was moving in the water. It wasn't wind or current. The pond was too still for that. I watched for a moment, my heart beating a little faster, but the movement stopped as suddenly as it started. I stood up, shook my head, and told myself it was nothing. Just an animal, a fish, or the wind. Nothing to worry about. But as I turned to leave, I heard something. like a crack of a twig, barely audible, but enough to make my skin crawl. I froze, my body instinctively tensing. The sound came from deeper in the woods, off to my right. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing, just the wind. I quickly walked back to the cabin, my pace quickening, though I couldn't explain why. There was a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and went straight to the kitchen to make some coffee. My hands were trembling just a little, but I told myself it was the cold air. That night, the wind picked up. I could hear it howling outside, pressing against the walls of the cabin. The sound of it rattling the windows made the quiet house feel even more isolated. I kept the fire in the fireplace going, trying to focus on the warmth it provided. The flames danced, casting long shadows across the room. I stayed up later than I expected, reading a book by the fire, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. There was nothing out there, just the wind, but my mind kept going back to the movement in the pond, the odd noise in the woods. Around midnight, I started to drift off. That's when I heard it again. Faint knock at the door. I sat up, my heart leaping in my chest. My eyes darted toward the front door. Another knock, this one louder. I stood up slowly, my legs heavy. I didn't know what to do. The rational part of me told me to ignore it. It was probably an animal, maybe something bumping into the door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I took a deep breath, grabbed a flashlight, and slowly walked toward the door. There was nothing, no one standing outside, just the darkness. I stood there for a moment, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night. My nerves were on edge, but I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I locked the door again, double-checked the windows, and went back to the couch. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. It wasn't the kind of fear you feel when you're being hunted. It was the fear of being alone, deep in the woods with no one around for miles, and something watching, something out there. The next day, I decided to leave. The unease hadn't gone away. I packed my things quickly, moving from room to room, grabbing everything I had brought. When I went to the front door, I paused. I hadn't heard any noises during the night, but something about the place still felt wrong. The wind had died down, but the air felt thick, oppressive. As I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The footprints in the snow leading from the woods right up to the cabin. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. Someone had been watching the cabin. Someone had walked right up to the door, then turned around and left. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints. My mind raced, but no thoughts made sense. I didn't know who it was or what they wanted. And for the first time, I realized that I hadn't been alone in the woods the whole time. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my bags, got into my car, and drove away as fast as I could. The road felt longer on the way back, the silence heavier. Every turn, every shadow in the trees made my heart race. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone following. When I finally reached the town, I didn't stop at the gas station. I didn't stop at the small diner. I kept driving all the way home, as far from that cabin as I could get. I didn't tell anyone what happened, couldn't. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Whoever was watching me, they were still out there, watching from the trees, waiting for the next person who was foolish enough to stay in that cabin.